Previously on Rebuilding Ange. Ange enjoyed the sun and the sausages in Australia before his skin complexion said no, this is too much in December, and he chose to go to Eintracht Frankfurt over AC Milan. Ange won his first 4 games in charge before the winter break, where we made a big difference transfer-wise, signing players that Daniel Levy only wishes he had the talent to bring in. Ange continued to do good work outside of UEFA Champions League round of 16 exit against Chelsea, and despite getting ever so Spursy late on in the season, they held on for a 4th place finish, qualifying for the Champions League, and Ange was clearly confident because he came out and said this.
Don't usually win things, I always win things, and we're sick of you.
We tried to help Ange with that by doing even more transfer business that Daniel Levy wishes he could do, and Ange's men got off to an absolute flyer, only dropping 1 league game and 1 Champions League game in the first half of the season. The good form continued into the new year, helped out by some more top transfer business, up until Ange managed to blow a 2-goal lead in the Champions League round of 16, going out to Liverpool off the back of his second league 3-0 defeat. Ange then got a little bit too angry at his players in the dressing room post-match, which led to a costly 3-match losing streak in the league that ended up costing them the title, despite the fact that Bayern never beat them all season, including in the DFB Pokal, where Ange was thankfully able to make sure he always won a trophy in his second season by lifting it over Hertha Berlin in the final, picking up the German Players Manager of the Year award and giving us a transfer budget of £85 million to work with going into Season 3, where he said,
Season 3 is better than Season 2.
There was some brief interest in Ange during the off-season from Crystal Palace, but seeing as those guys were only in the Europa League, Ange decided to stay. So heading into the German Super Cup against Bayern, we got stuck into the transfer window, not doing a lot of business, but making sure that it was quality, adding £31.5 million to our transfer budget by selling Feliz Scheibe to Sheffield United, as well as an extra £3.5 million by offloading Aurelio Menda to Lecce, seeing as Arthur Fiale was already confirmed to join the club a couple of years ago, but it only happened going to this new season, a nice pickup for just over $11 million. We also got another £31 million added to our transfer budget through the sale of Robin Koch, our former captain, but a player who did want to leave the club on a free at the end of his contract, as well as Mohamed Dahoud to Freiburg for just over £5 million. We used the money from those sales to bring in a new star centre-back in Ousmane Diamonde from Sporting for £50 million, as well as raiding Bayer Leverkusen for Pedro Hincapié for $51 million as a new first-choice left-back. And to replace Mohamed Dahoud, we bought in Alexander Pavlovic from Bayern Munich for a fee of just over £25 million. That meant that we've been bumped up to second on the season preview above Borussia Dortmund, but still a fair way off Bayern, heading into the Super Cup, a chance for Ange to pick up a trophy in his first game of the season. And unfortunately those defensive changes we made didn't quite make a difference in the Super Cup, as Bayern scored either side of half-time, first through Serhou Galassi, before with 5 minutes to go, Luis Diaz found Ferran Torres at the far post, and we suffered a 2-0 defeat as Ange stood there and had to watch Bayern lift the first trophy of the German season. That was followed by a nervy 2-1 defeat of one of the worst teams in the Zwei Bundesliga and Hansa Rostock to start the DFB Pokal defence, before Ange's men started the Bundesliga season on absolute fire with a 7-0 thrashing of Mainz, backed up with a 3-0 win at Wolfsburg thanks to a Jean-Matteo Bahoya hat-trick, before another 7-0 win, this time on the road over Hertha Berlin, with Ali Iwahi this time picking up a hat-trick. Jarell Kwanzaa was keen to leave the club going into deadline day, but none of the clubs with any active interest made a bid, so he stayed here and all our business was done before the Super Cup. And it was justified as we continued our hot start to the league season with a 3-0 home win over Paderborn thanks to a Tom Bischoff hat-trick, which saw us go into the start of the Champions League as the only Bundesliga team with a perfect record and a for and against of 20-0. Our league phase fixtures for the Champions League this season look a little bit easier than they did last time around, as shown somewhat for a reduction in our Champions League odds compared to last season, coming down from 600 to 1 to 200 to 1, starting off against the Barcelona team away, who last year put Ange to sleep during a 0-0 draw. And unfortunately, Ange's Frankfurt got found out big time as they went down early thanks to Rafinha scoring from down left-hand side before Barcelona made it 2-0 off the back of a Carnegie shocker, and Lewandowski gave Barca the cushion goal. Just before half-time, things got worse as Frankie de Jong made it 3-0 heading into the sheds. Ange was angry and it didn't improve in the second half as de Jong picked up a double and Frankfurt had suffered their first defeat since the Super Cup, being battered 4-0 at Barcelona. A poor result heading into a big top of the table Bundesliga clash where they'd travel to take on Bayern Munich. And unfortunately again, Ange's men didn't really show up as they were thumped 5-1 at the Allianz Arena. sending them down to second on the Bundesliga table, albeit still just 1 point off Bayern Munich. Ange was able to get his men back on track with a 2-0 home win over Schalke, thanks to Oskarsson and Bischoff in the second half, before making up for their Champions League opening blunder with a 4-2 win on the road over Porto, turning things round after a Samuel Amarodion first half double. But then in the Bundesliga, a missed Andreas shoulder-up penalty proved costly on the road at Cologne, as a mistake from new signing Piero Hincapié allowed Tillman to give Cologne the lead, and that missed penalty meant that Ange's men would drop more points in the Bundesliga, falling 4 points behind Bayern off the back of that 1-0 loss, and also losing an informed Tom Bischoff for 5 to 6 weeks with sprained knee ligaments. Normal transition resumed, including shoulder-up scoring from the penalty spot and a 2-0 home win over Gladbach, as well as a 3-0 home win over Fiorentina in the Champions League, before again Ange's men would drop points, this time blowing a lead twice in a 2-2 draw at Freiburg, seeing them now fall 6 points behind an unbeaten Bayern team. It was a big gap behind such a quality team so early in the season, and Ange was already thinking that the Champions League and DFB Pokal might be his best chances at securing trophies this season, starting by trying to get some revenge on Cologne in the second round of the DFB Pokal. They got the job done in that second round DFB Pokal tie over Cologne with a 3-0 win thanks to Oskarsson, Velasco and Pinier's second half goals, before a Jean-Matteo Bohoya double meant that Frankfurt got off to a hot start and a big clash against Dortmund to make sure they'd be the best of the rest and behind Bayern in the Bundesliga. And things only got better in the second half when Oskarsson sealed the result, making it 3-0. A good result considering shoulder-up had another penalty saved in the first half, albeit they were helped out at only 1-0 as Emre Can got a red card just before half-time, off the back of which they had a big tie in the Champions League away at AC Milan, and thankfully Ange's men got off to a good start as a Mannion save found its way to Oskarsson, who made it 1-0. Unfortunately, an Arthur Fiati own goal got AC Milan back into the game with only 15 minutes left, but a few minutes later Frankfurt were able to seal the result as Kanazun put one into the top left corner and gave Frankfurt 3 big away points, seeing them find their way inside the top 8 after 4 games played. They then go off to a good start on the road against Bayer Leverkusen, back in the Bundesliga off back of their relegation a couple of seasons ago, with Andreas Schutterup picking up a first half double, including finally putting one away from the penalty spot, but then they got Botley in the second, and Bayer Leverkusen made things interesting as a poor back pass from Oskarsson allowed Kofani to make it 2-1, and 10 minutes later it was Palacios who got a chance from the spot, and Bayer Leverkusen were able to rescue a point against Frankfurt, seeing them stay above Dortmund in third spot, only 1 point off Frankfurt, who were now 8 points behind the table-topping Bayern, who still hadn't suffered a defeat this season. A result made worse by the fact that early on they lost one of their key players in Jean-Matteo Bohoya, again for 5 to 6 weeks with sprained knee ligaments. Ange's men got back on track with a 2-0 home win over Heidenheim thanks to Velasco and Bischoff, and kept themselves firmly inside the Champions League top 8 with a 2-1 win in Hull over Galatasaray, and the board were clearly pleased with how Ange was going as they pumped up the transfer budget again, but this time by a whopping £51 million. Better say that me and Ange had a bigger night out than last season, and were actually missing from training the next day as we were nursing some almighty hangovers, only to find out off the back of a third round DFB Pokal win at home over Hoffenheim that Ange wasn't missing because of his hangover, but had snuck his way off to London to interview for the vacant Chelsea job. And off the back of a 0-0 draw against Hoffenheim, this time in the Bundesliga, confirmation came through that Ange got the job at Chelsea, albeit he'd have to wait until the 22nd of December to take over at Stamford Bridge. Thankfully, Ange kept his mind on the job before leaving for Chelsea, as he picked up some decent results, starting with a 0-0 draw against Inter in the Champions League, before back-to-back 3-1 Bundesliga wins away at Bochum and Stuttgart, before a 1-0 home win over Augsburg, ended his time in charge at Eintracht Frankfurt, with the club still 8 points behind Bayern Munich on the Bundesliga table, albeit 7 points clear of Schalke in second, having made their way through the quarterfinals in defence of their DFB Pokal, where they'd take on Union Berlin, with Bayern Munich having already been knocked out, and just sitting inside a top 8 spot in the Champions League, already guaranteed to be taking part in the first knockout playoff round. So while Ange was proud of what he built at Frankfurt, with some of his favourite players stepping up before he left so far this season, in the likes of Jean-Matteo Bohoya, the former Bayern man and Tom Bischoff, star left winger Andreas Schutterup, and his main man up front, Ali Wahi, it was officially time for Ange to move to his second club of this rebuild, well and truly looking to show Spurs what they were missing out on, as had arrived at Chelsea. I was a little bit concerned that Ange was leaving a Champions League club for in the Europa League, but once I saw the transfer budget available when we got there of just under £200 million, my fears were put to bed, especially as the squad already looked like they'd suit the 4-2-3-1 that Ange liked to play back at Frankfurt, and despite sitting 9th in the Premier League, we were only 5 points off Newcastle, who sat in 5th spot, which usually is good enough for the Champions League in the Premier League. And with the club expected to finish 5th in the league, you'd expect them to still have the quality to qualify for that Champions League, especially with the January transfer window coming up, our budget going down to $142 million once we adjusted it for Premier League wages, as well as the fact that even though the club were supposed to be taking part in the Europa League, that competition isn't working for some reason. I'll fix that the next time we do one of these. Must be a bug. Whoopsie. It was a quality squad that Ange would have at his disposal at Chelsea, with some world-class players like captain Cole Palmer, Moises Caicedo in midfield, alongside Enzo Fernandez, and Christopher Nkunku in attack, but there were a lot of injuries, in particular to some of those big players like Reece James, Raheem Sterling, who was gone for the rest of the season, a bit of a shame seeing as on FM he actually still looks quite decent, and Cole Palmer himself, having got injured a few days before Ange arrived. And wouldn't you know it, Ange's first game in charge of Chelsea would be against the team that showed a little bit of interest in him before the start of the season at Frankfurt and Crystal Palace, before in the last game before the January transfer window opened up, he'd get a chance at revenge against his former club in Tottenham Hotspur and new manager Thomas Frank. And Ange was able to get off to a good start in charge as they picked up a 2-0 win over Crystal Palace thanks to a first half goal to Martin Zubimendi, a recent addition from Arsenal, and a second half corner which Trevor Chalobah put away before not quite being able to get one over his former team, as it was a 0-0 draw when they hosted Spurs, where unfortunately again they'd lose Reece James, this time for 5 to 7 weeks with a broken toe. That meant Chelsea still sat a 9th going into the start of the January transfer window, and with Ange trying a few different roles to what he did at Frankfurt in his first few games in charge, which made the transfer window a little bit more difficult, especially as there was no chance to do any business before we took on a strong 3rd place Liverpool team. And despite the fact that Ange got his men to bounce back from an early Mohamed Salah goal, with Moises Caicedo striking back just off the back of half-time, it was defeat yet again for Ange at Anfield as Shigo Ekitike beat Jorgensen from a near-post corner to give Liverpool a 2-1 win, meaning Ange's men had a 1-win, 1-loss, 1-draw record heading into a rematch with Spurs, this time in the 3rd round of the FA Cup. And this time around, there was a lot more action, and thankfully for Ange, his team got off to the best start as Tyreek George gave Chelsea a 1-0 lead up until Richarlison made the most of a Paul Ben Chilwell back pass to make it 1-1 at half-time. Chelsea then got a bit lucky in the second half as off the back of a Bino Giddens cross, there was an own goal scored by Gabriel Montiel, and then with 12 minutes left, Christopher Nkunku got the chance to put the game to bed from the penalty spot, which is exactly what he did. So despite the fact that Chelsea only had 3 shots in the entire game and just 2 on target, both resulting in goals, they picked up a 3-1 win and made their way through to the next round of the FA Cup. And around the time of that big win over Spurs, we'd also done our first little bit of transfer business, offloading Alvin Sanchez to Udinese for $9.5 million, as well as Billy Gee to Watford for $300k, bringing in a new first choice goalkeeper, long overdue, and Diogo Costa for £44 million. Albeit he did get injured before coming here, so wouldn't be available for a couple of weeks. Ange was able to get the confidence flying off the back of that defeat of Spurs in the FA Cup, backing it up with another 3-1 win, this time in the Prem over West Brom, with Bino Giddens, Palmer and Nkunku on the score sheet. And leading into our next Premier League game where we took on Brighton away, we'd done even more transfer business, selling Malo Gusto to Atletico Madrid for £25 million, Trevor Chalobah to Inter for $30 million, and Philip Jorgensen to Porto for $66 million, presumably replacing Diogo Costa, and also getting rid of Nicholas Jackson to Fulham for £27 million, using some of that money to add some real quality to the squad, and Samuel Lino as a backup left winger for $18 million from Flamengo, bringing in a new first choice left back to replace Ben Chilwell, spending $79 million on Nico Schlotterbeck from Dortmund, giving Porto some of that Jorgensen money back to bring in Samu Omorodion for $95 million, usurping a struggling Liam Delap up front, and spending even more money in Portugal, this time at Benfica, to upgrade at centre-back with Antonio Silva coming in for $88 million. And big Samu up front made an immediate impact as his double meant that we picked up a 2-1 home win over Brighton, albeit it came at a big cost as Cole Palmer again got injured in one of his first games back from injury, this time tearing his hamstring and being ruled out for 7 to 10 weeks. We continue to rob Portugal on the transfer market, this time selling João Pedro to Porto for 42 million, despite the fact that he was on loan at Benfica earlier in the season, just before Liam Delat finally scored for us, making sure we got past Cardiff in the 4th round of the FA Cup. Off the back of which we replaced João Pedro for a more versatile attacking option with a bit more potential in Vitor Roque from Palmeiras for 28 million, and selling Benoit Badiashile to Real Madrid for 29.5 million, spending £12 million to bring Antonio Rudiger back to the club to replace him, as well as a little bit of a panic loan just in case Reece James kept getting injured at right back, as we brought in Shea Charles from Southampton as well on deadline day. Christopher Nkunku made sure that Ange kept getting the job done on the field while their business was going on with a 1-0 win at home over Aston Villa. Those last 3 wins making sure we'd now made our way into a European qualifying spot into 7th, only 2 points off Newcastle, up in 5th. Ange continued Chelsea's good run of form as they beat Everton 5-2 away from home before a 2-0 win at Wolverhampton, leading into a big clash where they'd host Manchester United, a team who'd just been taken over by Zinedine Zidane. A huge matchup with both teams chasing that last likely Champions League qualifying spot, which Chelsea had just got into off the back of those 5 straight wins. And Chelsea got off to a good start in the big Champions League qualifying clash as Christopher Nkunku gave them the lead halfway through the first half. Unfortunately, off the back of the restart though, a Manchester United free kick meant that Alejandro Garnacho, off the back of a deflection from Caicedo, got them all square at 1-1. But from there, Chelsea turned up the pressure, and it was Samuel Lino who rocketed one into the top right corner to give them a 2-1 lead, and from there Man United never got back into the game as some nice work from Vitor Roque off the bench picking up a double meant that Chelsea would pick up a huge 4-1 win, keeping them in 5th spot, but now 4 points clear of Newcastle in 6th and level with West Ham, who somehow were up in 4th. And the good news continued for Ange as he was able to celebrate as the man who took over from him at Tottenham Hotspur and Thomas Frank had just been sacked. It's fair to say Ange had a few wines that night. Goals to Delapin and Nkunku meant that Ange's men made their way through the quarterfinals of the FA Cup, getting past Brentford, Moises Caicedo being injured during the game, but only being out for 3 to 9 days, but it did mean he'd be missing as they took on a Newcastle United team led by an under pressure Jose Mourinho, who'd only picked up 1 win in their last 5 games. A win he would make sure Chelsea should go a long way to securing Champions League football for next season, extending the gap on Newcastle out to 7 points. But Ange's men got blown off the park early as Sven Botman gave Newcastle nearly 1-0 lead, and things only got worse from there. As just shy of the half-hour mark, it was Sandro Tonali from just outside the box who beat Diego Costa in the bottom right corner, and then just before half-time, the game was well and truly put to bed as Joel Linton made it 3-0 to the Geordies. Chelsea were better in the second half, but couldn't find a way past Ramsdale in goal, and they suffered a humiliating 3-0 defeat, allowing Newcastle as well as Manchester United to get right back in that Champions League qualifying race. Ange's men got back on track with a 3-0 home win over Bournemouth before they'd take on top of the Championship Burnley in the FA Cup quarterfinals. A clash which could be tricky with Moises Caicedo out for 11 days to 3 weeks with a twisted ankle, and new first choice striker Samu out for 2 to 4 weeks with the same injury. Those injuries potentially having an effect as this one went all the way to extra time before an orange injured Cole Palmer put one away from the penalty spot, and Chelsea finally put the game to bed with 1 minute to go with Bino Giddens finding Vitor Roque who would make sure Chelsea would go through the semis off the back of a 2-0 win. Unfortunately, the FA Cup quarter-final going to extra time meant that the boys were still tired a few days later, and they put out a sloppy performance as they suffered a 2-0 defeat away at Brentford, not helped out by an Antonio Silva own goal, getting his rating down to a 5.9. A result made worse by the fact that they'd now slipped down to 6th, dropping below Aston Villa and West Ham, and still only 1 point clear of Newcastle in 7th spot. Andrew to get his boys ready for their first game back from an international break after that Brentford loss, as it was a huge game as they'd take on 5th place West Ham, but unfortunately they lost Romeo Lavia during that break with a broken lower leg and have been gone for the rest of the season and probably for the early part of Ange's second season as well. And Ange's men didn't get off to a good start in this huge game in terms of Champions League qualification as Nicholas Fulkrug put one away just 10 minutes in past a lazy effort from Diego Costa, but thankfully only a few minutes later, Chelsea struck back as Cole Palmer would put one into the top left corner past Areola. Unfortunately, that was it for this game despite the dominance Chelsea had stats-wise, and it finished a 1-1 draw, allowing Newcastle to climb up to 5th, and both West Ham and Chelsea dropped down a spot, with Chelsea now only occupying a Conference League qualifying position, with things likely only get worse as they're about to host table-topping Manchester City. And despite holding out for most of the game, it was Man City who came away with all 3 points as House of Naipan put one past Costa on the volley with only 10 minutes left to give City all 3 points at Stamford Bridge, leaving Chelsea in 7th but having played one more game than Aston Villa, Newcastle and West Ham. Thankfully for Ange, their run home off the back of that City game did look easier, and they got off to a good start as Cole Palmer bounced back from a saved penalty, making amends with 15 minutes to go, drilling one to the bottom left corner past Bernd Leno to give Chelsea 3 points at Craven Cottage. Just the confidence boost they needed, their first win in 4 games before an FA Cup semi-final against 17th placed Leicester City. And Ange's men got off to the best start in the semi at Wembley, as it was Christopher Nkunku who capped off a fine run down the left-hand side to give Chelsea an early 1-0 lead. But unfortunately, only 10 minutes later, Leicester found their way back into the game, as it was Patson Daka who put one away in the top left corner. But only a few minutes off the back of that, Chelsea had a chance from set piece, and Nico Schlotterbeck would beat Hermansen from a corner. Chelsea were forced to play with 10 men for the last 35 minutes of this game, off the back of a Reece James red card, but thankfully for Ange, they just managed to hold on and made their way through to an FA Cup final, where they'd surprisingly take on Brighton and Hove Albion off the back of an upset 2-1 win over Arsenal. Ange's men continue to make the most of their easier looking late season fixtures as they picked up a 4-2 win on the road over Sunderland, a result which was just enough to get them above Aston Villa up to 5th in the Premier League, before an early long-range Enzo Fernandez goal and a second-half one for Summit Mamelodian made sure they got past mid-table Norwich 2-0 at Stamford Bridge, allowing them to now grab a 3-point gap over Aston Villa in 5th spot. Big Samu came up big for them again, this time on the road at Leicester, as they grabbed 3 more points during a midweek game to send them up to 4th with only 2 games left in their Premier League season. Cole Palmer then made sure Chelsea saw out their 3-match week leading into the FA Cup final, as he scored either side of half-time to give them a 2-0 win over a Crystal Palace team who Ange defeated in his first game in charge at Chelsea, pulling them 6 points clear of Newcastle and Aston Villa, albeit those teams had a game in hand that they'd be playing while Chelsea took part in the FA Cup final. Ange knew this was a massive chance for him to pick up a trophy in his first season at a Premier League club, something he couldn't do back at Tottenham Hotspur. Brighton came into this game going with a 4-2-3-1, the exact same formation that Ange uses with his Chelsea team, and he will be going with a strong lineup, with Wesley Fofana staying at right back over the suspended Reece James, and for some reason Ben Chilwell at left back, despite the fact that we signed Schlotterbeck to be the first choice left back. Cole Palmer was at right wing with no Raheem Sterling, while Samuel Lino in some good form was preferred over Jamie Bino Giddens. And Chelsea came out the blocks firing at Wembley, as from a corner it was Samu who gave them an early 1-0 lead, and from the very next highlight things only got worse for Brighton as Caicedo found captain Cole Palmer who made it 2-0, and at the half-hour mark it was Christopher Nkunku who gave Chelsea a 3-0 lead heading into half-time. Samuel Lino gave away a penalty which allowed Brighton to find their way back into the game just after half-time, but only a few minutes later, Samu completed a double and gave Chelsea their breathing room back. Moises Caicedo put a cherry on top with only 20 minutes to go, and Big Ange was able to lift the domestic cup for the second season in a row as a manager, this time in England by lifting the FA Cup off the back of a 5-1 final win with Chelsea over Brighton. Ange and his players enjoyed a big night out in London off the back of this FA Cup success, Ange not being used to winning a trophy in his first season in charge, but he also knew that his fellas had to back up in 8 days' time as they travelled to take on Spurs in a big derby where if they didn't pick up points, they could slip down from 4th spot in the Premier League and miss out on the Champions League for next season. and Ange's men delivered early when it counted as Nico Schlotterbeck popped up from a corner and gave Chelsea a 1-0 lead at the Tottenham Hotspur Stadium. But unfortunately, just before half-time, a ball floated far post from Kulusevski allowed Romero to equalise at half-time. A point would have been enough to make sure Ange's men would make their way through to the Champions League next season, but when Kulusevski scored deep into injury time, it meant that Spurs' 2-1 win put Chelsea's Champions League chances for next season at real jeopardy. Ange faced a nervous wait as, depending on goal differential, both Newcastle and Aston Villa could sneak their way above Chelsea and drop them down into the Europa League. Newcastle got the job done 1-0 over Leicester City thanks to a Sandro Tonali injury time goal, but thankfully this time Liverpool helped out Ange as they came back from an early Ivan Toney goal to beat Aston Villa 3-1 at Anfield, meaning that Chelsea have finished 5th in Ange's first season in charge, a spot that should be enough for them to make their way into the Champions League for his second season at Stamford Bridge. While Ange nervously waited to make sure that Chelsea indeed had qualified for the Champions League next season, Todd Bowley called and gave him an £82 million transfer budget to work with in Season 2, with the wage budget also getting a little bit of a top up to just under $300k. But eventually Ange's anxiety had been put to rest as Chelsea were confirmed to take part in the Champions League through their 5th place finish. The only downside being that crosstown rivals Arsenal had finally picked up a Champions League with a 1-0 win over Liverpool in the final, albeit I was quite relieved as it meant that Eintracht Frankfurt hadn't picked it up after Ange ditched them, with them being knocked down in the quarterfinals by PSG 2-1. But Andoni Iraola had done a decent job in his first half season at Frankfurt, making sure they held on to the DFB Pokal with a win in the final over Stuttgart, and clearly being the best of the rest behind Bayern. Captain Cole Palmer was clearly the best player at Chelsea this season as he picked up a 7.27 average rating with 18 goals and 5 assists. It would be crucial that we kept hold of him for Ange's second season, despite interest from Saudi Arabia and Real Madrid. Nico Schlotterbeck had a good start to life at Chelsea, picking up a 7.09 average rating in his 25 appearances, even if Ange never actually played him at left back like we thought he would, and Diogo Costa, Esteval, Enzo Fernandez, Christopher Nkunku, and Samuel Lino also did a good job picking up green ratings in a large number of appearances. So at the end of an interesting season where Ange made the trip from Frankfurt back to London, he'll be back in the Champions League fully next season with a strong Chelsea team, and he couldn't help himself in the media, reminding everyone that yet again,
I don't usually win things, I always win things in my second year. Nothing's changed.